Well, thank you everyone for joining this presentation on the Far Eastern Curlew. I acknowledge the collaborators that I've worked with on this project, Brad Woodworth and Richard Fuller from the University of Queensland, and thank you to my supervisor and boss, Stephen Garnett from Charles Darwin Uni. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the country that I'm presenting from today, so that's the Larrakia country, and we'd like to pay our respect to the elders past, present and emerging. So in this presentation, I'll introduce you to the Far Eastern Curlew, why we're working on this bird, what the main aim of the project is, what we did and what we found, both internationally and locally here in Australia, and then what the management implications are, and then some questions and discussion. So here is the Far Eastern Curlew. It's one of the largest migratory shorebirds in the world. It's predominantly a coastal bird, and here in this photo you can see the bird out on the mud with its long bill that it's just used to take a crab from the mud. It spends its time in the East Asian Australasian flyway, which is like a super highway for migratory birds. Here in this flyway, it's endemic. So out of all of the flyways of the world, it is found only in this area. So you can see the extent of its range here in the coloured areas, which is just a subset of the East Asian Australasian flyway. It breeds in the Northern Hemisphere in places like southern Siberia and northern China. It then spends its time travelling through Eastern Asia and the Yellow Sea, and then further south to Australia and New Zealand, where it spends the non-breeding season. So with its multinational lifestyle, of course, it's got many threats to the bird. So on the breeding grounds, hunting is a major threat to the bird, and also the intensification of wetlands and the change of these wetlands and grasslands to the bird. When it's flying through the Yellow Sea region in Eastern Asia, it's threatened by the loss of habitat, so tidal reclamation, as well as illegal catching and bycatch of these birds, which is threatening the bird species during its very tight funneled habitat use of that Eastern Asian area. And here we've got the very stark and sad decline of many migratory species over time. And what's been found is that the migratory shorebirds, the threatened shorebirds from Australia have declined over many decades. And this has been known for quite some time. And in this graph, you can see that decline since 1985 for the threatened migratory shorebirds. So that's the 7 shorebird species that are listed threatened birds. Out of those, the bird that has done one of the worst is the Far Eastern Curlew, which has suffered this dramatic decline over time. And it's now been listed as a globally endangered species under the IUCN Red List, which has also meant the bird is critically endangered under the Australian Commonwealth Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, and it's got a single species action plan under the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership. And then in 2015, when it was listed as a critically endangered species, it also had a range of actions and threats listed against its name in the Wildlife Conservation Plan by the Department of the Environment back then, and due for review currently. So with all of this known and its global movements, why are we working on this project? Why have we spent time on this project? Well, research has shown that if birds have good, high-quality habitat across the non-breeding ground, they actually have a better chance of survival and successful breeding seasons during the next stage of their migration life cycle. So we wanted to understand the movements and the home range sizes of individual curlews across the non-breeding ground, so that's here in Australia, and what their ecological requirements are while the birds are here. And we wanted to do this so we could help planners and managers mitigate any of these potential effects from coastal development. And the Far Eastern Curlew can be considered a flagship species. It's a species that can be used to protect a whole range of the whole composition of the 37 migratory species that spend time here in Australia on the non-breeding grounds. It's often individually handpicked for conditions under environmental impact assessments and further coastal development work. So the main aim of this project was to investigate the habitat use of the Far Eastern Curlew while it's on the non-breeding grounds in Australia, so that we can provide these strategic guidance directions to developers and decision makers. So what we did was we set out to understand that fine scale habitat use and movements across the non-breeding grounds. And we looked at 4 different regions in Australia, and in Darwin in the Northern Territory, where I'm based now, in Roebuck Bay, Western Australia, where I'll be based next week, and in Moreton Bay, Queensland, and then also in Western Port Victoria. And these areas are nationally and internationally significant for the Far Eastern Curlew because of the numbers of these birds that are supported within those regional systems. So these are highly important areas for the bird, and we wanted to learn about how these birds are existing within those regional harbours. Now on this map, what you can see is a shading, a gradient of colours. And this is a species distribution modelled map which shows the likelihood of occurrence. And what we see is that the occurrence of the Far Eastern Curlew is from the northwest of Australia through the northern coastline and then the eastern seaboard across the east coast. Now, these species distribution models are incredibly important at understanding the course distribution of where a species can occur. But what we don't get from such an approach is that fine scale movement and understanding of what is happening. And so that's where our project has come in. And so what we did was, over a couple of years and seasons when the birds were here in Australia, we set out to catch birds, and we caught 22 birds and attached these GPS and satellite tracking devices to the birds. We did this with the help of many volunteers, many scientists along the way, many researchers from the East Asian Australasian flyway, people from Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, and also First Nations Indigenous people that have worked with us alongside this project. And so what we found was this migration of the 22 different birds, and this map here shows the broad scale complete migration tracks of all of the birds. And they're from our 4 regional study areas, completing their complete migration. And we've worked on a range of papers, research papers from this aspect of the study. And we have looked at the network of habitat use, the connectivity of the migration of these birds, and how that differs with our northwest birds, so the birds from the Western Australia and here in Darwin, compared to the birds from southeast Queensland and Victoria, what is happening along their flyway, and potentially how those different migration strategies might impact the conservation of the species. We've also looked at how the birds undertake this migration. So at what height the birds fly at, the altitudinal migration of these birds. And what we've found is that birds actually fly quite low during their migration, and there's many benefits to flying low at completing this migration. Of course, there's some variation in that, and we've had records of birds flying up to 5,000 meters altitude. And finally, we've also looked at the habitat change and measuring that change, sometimes the loss, sometimes the gain of the important habitats that the Far Eastern Curlew uses throughout its migration stage. And so from these migratory studies, we found that the Far Eastern Curlew spends nearly 60% of its annual cycle in Australia's borders. And that's the most country recorded by far of its entire migration life cycle. But we also need to learn more about the intensity of the threats on the breeding grounds. So that is what's happening when these birds are on the nest on the breeding grounds in northern China and southern Siberia. There's also a lack of knowledge on the Far Eastern Curlew in places of Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the South Pacific Islands. And so what we recommend is to manage holistically across the full annual cycle of the Far Eastern Curlew, and of course, further research. Locally, we discovered that tagged individual curlews are repeatedly using these same roosting and feeding sites, but the home range size has varied across the 4 study regions. But importantly, each curlew has a discrete home range area, but they occur at low densities across these large regional harbours. So that might indicate some competition between individuals within the population and also some territoriality between birds. So that's the protection of their resources that they want to access when they're here on the non-breeding grounds. The curlews were incredibly regular in how they roost and how they feed, how they're using this habitat connected together as a network. And importantly, the curlews showed an incredibly strong preference for intertidal habitats with soft substrate. And that's so that they can use their long down curved bill to stick into the mud and take a crustacean. So they're one of their main prey items. So here we have a map of Darwin Harbour in the Northern Territory, showing our home range estimates of our 3 tagged curlews. You can see here that the area is alongside the Darwin CBD, alongside coastal mangroves and intertidal mudflats, and also alongside an industrialised area, which is Darwin Port's East Arm Wharf, the large importing and exporting area for the Northern Territory. From our study here, we present the average core home range size for these 3 birds of 2 square kilometres. So that is the area that is shaded, focused around those GPS tracking points. In Roebuck Bay, Western Australia, we were successful at catching more birds. So we were able to track 8 birds in the Roebuck Bay area, and we found an average core home range size, so that's the shaded area, of 22.3 square kilometres. You can see here that in this region, it's a mostly natural environment. There is not as high a human population in the region. It's fairly remote, and the birds are using this soft substrate along the Roebuck Bay coastline, as well as the salt marsh behind the mangroves. In Moreton Bay, Queensland, where there is a high human population and a lot of modified industrialised areas, we were able to track a number of birds, and we learnt that the average core home range size was 39.6 square kilometres. You can see here that the birds are using a range of natural and modified environments, with two species there occurring alongside the Brisbane Port area, so using that coastal area adjacent to Brisbane Port. In the Western Port, where we have mostly agriculturally modified environments, we were able to track 3 birds, and we found an average core home range size of 32.4 kilometres and square kilometres. And you can see here that the movement of these birds, although it's just 3 individuals, is highly repetitive. So this is over multiple seasons. You can see that the birds are using the same roosting and feeding habitats repeatedly. So what this suggests is that we have an obligation to consider the entire life stages of the Far Eastern Curlew. Importantly, the birds are spending more than 50% of their time here in Australia. So we have quite the obligation to protect these birds while they're here on the non-breeding grounds. So what we recommend is that planners and regulators consider both the feeding and roosting habitat at the regional level and not just these site-based impacts. Now, the reason why we suggest that is because we have only sampled a small number of individuals due to the incredibly tough nature of catching these birds and putting the tracking devices on them. So importantly, there's many more individuals within the population of the Far Eastern Curlew. So it will be strategic to consider the whole of the regional harbour when managing these birds. We suggest also that both roosting and foraging habitat types need protection because of how repeatedly they're being used, and you can't have one without the other. Soft substrate is absolutely critical to the survival of this species, and we've shown that through our tracking of the birds on those local movements of the non-breeding grounds. The roost sites that the birds use during these spring tides, which occur every 2 weeks, also considered king tides, these roost sites are particularly valuable because during these times there's not very much other habitat for the birds to be using. And so what we also potentially recommend is that if there is a loss or degradation of these natural roosting areas, there is the potential to offset the activity by creating alternative roost sites. But we stress that this needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And what we've seen at Darwin Port's East Arm Wharf is the accidental creation of important roosting habitat for these birds. And further to this, we suggest that managers and planners use the home range estimates to inform areas to conserve as a minimum, but also do the site-specific research and surveys to understand what's happening at a local context. So where tracking and tagging is not available, we recommend that surveyors might do surveys where they watch where the birds are flying to, because that might indicate repeat movement, repeat behaviours of these birds and the habitat that they're using. But also the areas that curlews feed in, these soft substrate intertidal habitats, should be avoided for development because these are areas where it's almost impossible to offset based on the current knowledge that we have and that we've presented from our study. So I'd like to thank you for tuning in today and for supporting this project. And we welcome some questions and any feedback on the project. Here's a QR code to our project website with all of our publications and fact sheets, including community fact sheets with the ranger groups that we've worked with. And our final report is available for those that don't have it yet. We will be sending it out shortly. So thank you very much.